Good morning. So this morning, I'm going to continue talking about the Fukanzazengi. This is talk number 6. And if you want to listen to the earlier ones, they're on YouTube, the Ocean Gate channel. So, okay, so the part we're going to talk about today is enlightenment must be deportment beyond hearing and seeing. Is it not a principle that is prior to knowledge and perceptions? This being the case, intelligence or lack of it does not matter. Between the dull and the sharp-witted, there is no distinction. If you concentrate your efforts single-mindedly, that in itself is negotiating the way. So first of all, maybe I should backtrack a little bit and say that Fukanzazengi is Dogen's most famous fascicle. It's not a fascicle really, it's a text, but it's not in the Shobogenzo. Anyway, it's the most famous instruction on how to sit zazen, how to meditate in Dogen's war of teachings. Okay, so the first line, enlightenment must be deportment beyond hearing and seeing. Is it not a principle that is prior to knowledge and perceptions? So deportment beyond hearing and seeing. So in the section right before this, in the Fukanzazengi that I talked about last time, Dogen wrote about the bringing about of enlightenment cannot be fully understood by discriminative thinking. So in other words, this activity of realization is more than what our conscious perceptions can perceive. So it's not something that our intellectual mind can grasp. And in Dogen's previous examples of awakening, kind of triggers that he gives are, remember, it's a fist, a staff, a shout, and those kinds of examples of Zen masters who did things at just exactly the right moment and awakened a student. And we talked about, various stories that went with Dogen's examples. So these are these nonverbal expressions. And so, I've known people who have a lot of intellectual understanding, especially about the doctrine of emptiness, and they think that somehow that's realization, but it's not. It's good to have a kind of understanding about these things and understand kind of the map, but you still have to walk the map. And in Soto Zen, the way we walk the map is, a big way we walk the map is by sitting zazen. So there's something deeper going on than our individual body and mind. And at the same time, we have to do the work. At the same time, as an individual, we have to engage in the practice of, in this case, Dogen saying we have to engage with zazen. And if we engage with zazen, we engage with all of reality, which is something going on beyond our intellect. So in this sentence, enlightenment must be deportment. So deportment in Dogen in Japanese is a word igi, I-I-G-I, igi is deportment. And Dogen wrote a whole fascicle about deportment called Gyobutsu Igi, deportment of the practicing Buddha. So he thought it was important enough to write a whole essay on it. But essentially, deportment is how we conduct ourselves with other people, how we practice with the totality of our circumstances. And for Dogen, that has to do with the Bodhisattva path. How do we function in this world of samsara? How do we do things that are helpful? And then the next line is, this part of this line is, must be deportment beyond hearing and seeing. So hearing and seeing, again, specifically refers to a verse by a Zen master named Kyogen Chikan. And Kyogen Chikan, upon his awakening, said, "No traces wherever I go, deportment beyond sound and form." So that's what Dogen's pointing to, is a story, which I would like to tell you at this point. So the story goes, and Dogen refers to the story actually a fair amount in his teachings. So, and you might have heard about it, the story of the Zen master who wakes up either from, it's easily talked about, either talked about as he's sweeping and a pebble flies up and hits a bamboo, or somehow a tile hits a bamboo, and then he awakens. So here's the story. And Dogen tells the story a couple places, but he tells it in Kaisei Shoku, Sanshoku, which is sound of the stream, form of the mountains, which is actually quite a beautiful fascicle and not so hard to read. Okay, so here's how he tells the story. When Chan Master Kyogen Chikan was studying the way in the community of Chan Master Dawei, Dawei said to him, "You are intelligent and learned. Without something memorized from commentaries, say a line for me that as you were before your father and mother were born." Okay, I'll repeat the question again. He said, "You are intelligent and learned. Without anything memorized from commentaries, say a line for me as you were before your father and mother were born." And Chikan couldn't answer the question. So that's a kind of a stumper, right? Say something about before you're about who you were before your father and mother were born. And this is a key part of the story. He said, "You are intelligent and learned without something from memorized from commentaries." So he wasn't interested in him coming up with something that he had memorized from some commentary about Buddhism. So then the story goes on. Deeply regretting his body and mind, he searched through volumes he had collected over the years and was still stumped. So even after the teacher had said, "Don't come back to me with something that you've memorized," he still went back to his books and started trying to figure out what it meant. Kind of analogous if you were doing koan practice, where you come to the teacher and you sit down in the room and the teacher says, "Well, who were you before your father and mother were born?" And bang, you're supposed to say something, right? And that's like your understanding at that moment. So it'd be like if you went back, there are all these books now that you can read and they give you the answers to koans, right? And so it's like if you went into the teacher and you said, emptiness, nothing holy, or something like that, which is what Bodhidharma said, they'd ring the bell and say, "Get out of here. Come back when you've got something, less intelligent to say." Something more from your heart, something more from your deepest understanding. So anyway, not having figured this out, Chikan, he goes back through all of his stuff and he still can't find anything. And finally he says, "A painted rice cake does not satisfy hunger. I vow that I shall not seek to understand the Buddha Dharma in this life. I shall simply become a meal-serving monk." So he says, "I vow that I shall not seek to understand the Buddha Dharma in this life." So, he's saying, okay, obviously the path I'm on isn't working. So it's not about my intellect. I'm going to let it all go and just kind of like serve people. I'm going to serve, I'm just going to like be at the temple, keep the place clean, serve meals, whatever, that kind of stuff. But I'm not going to try to be some kind of learned person who gives these exegesis on sutras or things like that. Okay, so he does this for years and months, according to Dogen, providing the gruel and rice to his fellow monks. And okay, at some point, Chikan just completely gives up on his ability to figure out the answer to this question. So he goes back to Dawei and he says about himself in the third person, "Chikan, confused in body and mind, cannot say anything. The Reverend should say something for me." So he's asking Dawu for the answer. Dawu says, "I don't refuse to say something for you, but you would likely resent me later." So that's interesting. He's not going to give him the answer. And the other thing is, it's embedded in this, is he has faith in this student that he is going to have a realization at some point about the answer to this question. And so he's not going to give him the answer to the question. Kind of like doing a crossword puzzle. You go, well, should I do the reveal? You know, when you're online, there's a little white box up there. You could get the reveal to this word. Like, do I do that? Or do I really kind of stick with this crossword and see if I can figure it out? So he says, you're going to resent me later if I do this. Okay, so then Chikan, with Dao Wei's permission, he goes and he builds a hermitage in the mountains, and basically he's just living up there. And Dogen says, he planted bamboo to keep him company. And then, and another translation of this says that the bamboo were his friends. So then once when Chikan was clearing a path, a piece of tile flew up, hit against a bamboo, and upon hearing the sound, Chikan had a great awakening. So this is this non-intellectual great awakening that he had. Unfortunately, we can't replicate that. It's unlikely that if you go into your garden and start flinging pebbles around with your broom, that it's probably not going to happen for you. Anyway, bathing and purifying himself, he faced Mount Dawei, offered incense, made vows, and said to Dawei, most Reverend Dawei, if long ago you had explained it to me, how could this have happened? So he said, if you told me the answer, how could I have come to this on my own? And he said, the depth of your kindness is greater than that of a parent. And then he composed a verse that he spoke. And it is, I'm not going to go into the meaning of the whole verse because of time, but this is where this phrase is embedded. He said, once hit and I lost what I know. One hit and I lost what I know. I won't be training myself again. Action and rest promote the old path. I won't be sinking into worry. Without traces wherever I go, deportment beyond sound and form, masters of the way in all quarters will call this the highest faculty. And then he presented this gata to Dao Wei, and Dao Wei said, this child has penetrated it. So he's saying, yes, you've now got the answer to the question I asked. Okay, so if you look at the story, you might think that Dao Wei relied upon his perceptions of sound and form to awaken, but that would be a mistake because he heard the sound of the pebble hitting the bamboo. So it's true that Chikan's in a body and he has perceptions and forms and sensations and those things that we identify as the skandhas. And he did experience something through his senses, but the point of this is that he went beyond sound and form to directly experience. What he directly experienced is actually, from a Buddhist perspective, was not from his ears or his eyes. Something more was happening there. And so if we remember that Chikan was caught by his intellect, that he really struggled to free himself from being caught and living in his head. So ultimately what he understood was more basic than this. And it was something deeper about this intimacy with all beings as manifest through the bamboo, because what we experience and manifest and interact with is going to be something particular, not something that's vague and kind of, that's kind of theoretical to say, oh, I'm going to interact with all beings, right? That's a little vague and has no specificity, because the reality is that we do live in the form world and that we do interact with specificity and particularity, but that specificity and particularity is all beings manifest. So then Dogen says, is it not a principle that is prior to knowledge and perceptions? Is it not a principle that is prior to knowledge and perception? So the whole thing is enlightenment. In the actual translation, it says it, but enlightenment must be deportment beyond hearing and seeing. Is it not a principle that is prior to knowledge and perceptions? this being the case, intelligence or lack of it does not matter. Between the dull and the sharp-witted, there is no distinction. If you concentrate your efforts single-mindedly, that in itself is negotiating the way. So it's not a principle that is prior to knowledge and perceptions. So the word in Japanese for principle is kishoku. And if you look up the meaning for kishoku in a dictionary, you'll find out that in English, what it means is wheel, tract, rule, pattern, and principle. Wheel, tract, rule, pattern, and principle. So if we kind of take this from a Buddhist perspective and say, okay, well, how could we understand each of those words from a Buddhist perspective? So wheel is like the great Dharma wheel, the wheel of the Dharma, which rolls continuously through our practice and the practice of all beings. So this is that great Dharma wheel that's rolling. And this is the path of Zazen. It's like the rolling out of the great tongue of the Buddha. So there are the Buddha in a kind of mythological way. He has this massive tongue that can roll out for miles. And when he rolls out his tongue, everyone who hears the sermon, regardless of what language they speak, understands it. So this great wheel of the Dharma rolling is like that. And this is this language of the Dharma that can be manifest and understood by all beings, and from Dogen's perspective through sitting Zazen. And then tract, there's a Zen saying, which is one strip of iron for 10,000 miles. One strip of iron for 10,000 miles. So it refers to the unity of myriad phenomena. And I always think about that as an image of one railroad track, just going endlessly down all the way to the horizon and disappearing. And that it's this one great function, as we say in Zen, this one great function of everything working together, making the world through all of the relationships of all beings, all things, everything we can imagine and talk about working together, this one great rail and function of the Dharma going forward. And then the rule would be a kind of how the Dharma rule is. So the Dharma itself, so there's Dharma with a big D and Dharma with a little d. Dharma with a little d means things, phenomena. Dharma with a big D means the teachings. And sometimes it's translated as law. Usually we translate it as the teachings, but you can also find it as the law, or this rule is a kind of basic tenet, the rule of the Dharma about how things are. And we say it's a great majestic Dharma because it's this one unity of the totality, but the totality of everything functioning together and making the world. And then this great function is a pattern. It's Indra's net. So Indra's net, if you know about that, that's a Huayan image, which is that from the Avatamsaka Sutra, that the whole of the universe is like a net, like a fisherman's net. And in each place where the net's tied is a jewel. And that jewel reflects every other jewel in the net. And this net is like a hologram. So it's like everything reflecting everything else. And if you see the reflection in one thing, you can see the reflection in all things. And so it's holographic in that way. So the parts are the whole, and the whole is parts simultaneously. So this great function is like a pattern, and it's like Indra's net, and everything's joined and reflects everything else. So all this functioning is this kind of massive effort and result. It's the causal nexus that creates reality itself. So, of course, we're not separate from that. We are part of that. And to manifest this function in the wholesome way is to manifest compassion and to manifest skillful means and wisdom. and wisdom as a technical term means that we see how that great mandala is functioning. And that is realized action. And that is Dogen's definition of the deportment of a Buddha. And then all of this together is principle. And you can see in our translation, and most of the translations is, it is not a principle that is prior to. So probably they chose the word principle, the translator, because principle is a technical term. And principle actually refers to, and I'm not going to go into this, refers to a Chinese thing called li, which is translated as ri, R-I in Japanese. And it's an overarching understanding of meaning that each part of the whole or thing is at the same time the whole of all things inter-aring and making the world. So that's Indra's now. And this is this principle. And all these things are happening at the same time. And if we understand this, it helps, I think, to understand it intellectually because you have some kind of map. But to really deeply understand this, we have to experience it directly. And so that, again, sitting Zazen is allowing the possibility of that direct experience to come into your body mind, which is what Dogen's pointing to. So then Dogen says, this being the case, intelligence or lack of it does not matter. Between the dull and the sharp-witted, there is no distinction. If you concentrate your efforts single-mindedly, that in itself is negotiating the way. So our practice realization, and again, practice realization means that we do not practice in Soto Zen to become enlightened. Our practice itself is a activity that is generated by our innate Buddha nature. So we do practice because some realized part of ourselves realizes that practice is something that we want to do. So we don't become practice. We don't do practice to become realization. Practice is an expression of realization itself. So from Dogen's point of view, to sit Zazen, that's one of the practices we do, is a manifestation of one's kind of innate realization. So our practice realization isn't dependent on how intellectually smart we are. And he says, so there he says, between the dull and the sharp-witted, there is no distinction. So, you know, it's true that Fukanzazengi is, particularly the middle section of it, is definitely an instruction to us about how we should sit Zazen. So he gives definite instructions that we read and we understand with our mind. But those instructions are absolutely useless unless we sit Zazen and do the Zazen in a way that we are making the effort to do them to follow the instructions. Because if we just sit down and all we do is fantasize or dream or go to sleep or whatever, then that's not where we want to put our effort. Now, sometimes we can't help it. Sometimes we sit down and we do just fall asleep, or we sit down and we do just go off, you know, on something that seems more compelling. But when we realize we're doing it, our effort is to come back to the present moment and just presence ourselves. So if when we do that, and then we say to ourselves, forget it, I'm not going to do that, I'd rather be doing this, then maybe we're not putting the effort into it. Or maybe you should go talk to your teacher and say, maybe, you know, because maybe you can't do it. Maybe there's something about this that you can't do it. So you need, sometimes we just need space to kind of let our minds be doing what our minds are doing for a while until we kind of come back. So it's hard to know ourselves. Are we being lazy, or are we doing something that we need to do with our minds, right? So that's hard to know. That's why we have teachers, so we can go and say, this is what's happening for me, and I can explore this. But by and large, that effort that we're making is to actually come back to the present moment. So that's not an intellectual activity. That activity is the effort that we're making to really just experience our reality as it is right now. And So that isn't dependent upon how intellectual you are or how, as Dogen says, dull or sharp-witted, which is also in the, what is it, the Sandokai as well. That's a line in the Sandokai. So to concentrate your effort single-mindedly is this making the sincere effort to do the practice. And, you know, even if you say to yourself, I can't sit at Zazen because my mind is doing all this other stuff, I encourage you to still come and sit Zazen because there's something going on in your body that you don't know about. So you have to sit Zazen in order to even have a chance of sitting Zazen, right? If you know you don't sit Zazen and you spend your time doing something else, then how can Zazen work its magic on you while you're, you know, thinking that you're doing something else? So there's that side of it as well. Okay, so Dogen's here in this part of the Fukanzazengi, he's pointing to this deeper meaning. He's pointing to the ties in our lineage because he tells a story or points to the story about Shikon. Earlier, he talks about the teachers awakening their students through these various methods. And he's asking us to, extolling us to make this effort, encouraging us to make this effort in practice. So that is today's commentary on Fukanzazengi. Thank you very much.